Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. I'm Alex, your host, as always. And for now, who has it better than us? Nobody, at least through 1 week that the Chargers take down the Raiders 22-10 in week one. This is the Bolt Breakdowns post-game show. You will see this every week after the Chargers play a game, whether that's on Thursday or Monday or Sunday. Let's get right into the game. And, I thought in general, this was a pretty wire-to-wire effort, gritty win, if you want to call it, for the Chargers in the head coaching debut of one Jim Harbaugh. Big win over a division rival, always big. SoFi was packed with what looked like 70% Raiders fans. And once again, they do not win at SoFi Stadium, which was a really good feeling. Raiders fans were talking crazy. So it was just nice to get this win and really, getting into kind of what was on the field now. I had big questions about what this defense was going to be. And, anytime you heard a player talk about this defense that Jesse Minter was installing, it was, hey, he wants us to react fast. We don't have to think. We play fast. We play aggressive. And, at certain points in the offseason, you're like, yeah, but let's see it, right? Even Khalil Mack, sort of was asked about Jesse Minter's defense, and he said, hey, I'm ready to put it on tape against the Raiders a couple weeks ago, entering, this, prep week. So clearly, I think there was some anxiousness to get out there, but there were also some questions that needed to be answered about exactly how this would look. And it's just one game. You don't want to overreact and jump to conclusions, about what the rest of the season is going to look like. But this was a really, really good effort for a week one game. And I think some of the stops that the Chargers got early on the Raiders really changed what this game looked like, particularly the run stops that they had on early drives. Joey Bosa was in there. Poona Ford was in there. Then Poona Ford getting that 4th and 1 stop really changed the complexion of this game. And I think the Raiders only ended up rushing for 63 yards, something like 19 carries. And that you take that as a win if you're the Chargers. And we've opined about the run defense, particularly in recent seasons. Run defense was a little bit better for the Chargers in certain games last year, but obviously then the pass defense kind of went on them. But, again, wire-to-wire, complete defensive effort to the point where, you take the running game out for the Raiders and basically force Gardner Minshew to throw to beat you, right? And Minshew obviously did not have the greatest game by his standards today. The Chargers corners, for the most part, were pretty solid. Held Devontae Adams, in check compared to what we've seen him do in some previous Chargers games. So overall, I mean, you got to be really impressed with the defense. And I think it all started particularly up front. Mentioned Poona Ford, who I think had the big 4th and 1 stop that really set the tone for the game, right? Because even in that fourth quarter where Antonio Pierce, 4th and 1 for the Raiders, big moment, really like all the analytical models say the Raiders should go for it, and they decide not to. Now, as Jim Harbaugh, I think it was, said in his post-game press conference, part of that was the Chargers' offensive struggles, right? They had a lot of 3-and-outs. So if you're the Raiders, maybe in some way you go, okay, well, they're probably not going to score on this drive, or we can count on our defense to get a stop. Let's play it safe here. But I think even in the back of Antonio Pierce's mind, a little bit was like, oh, like they've been playing some really solid run defense with Mack, with Bosa, with Ford, as I mentioned before, Otito Ogbonya getting quite a bit of push. And so that looked a lot different than I was expecting it to in terms of the physicality and just the difference of, outside of Ford, mostly the same players we've seen in recent seasons, but just have a certain re-energized look to them, right? I thought it was, tremendous performance from Joey Bosa. I don't think it can be stressed enough. I think he only ended up having, 1 sack, but ton of pressures, knocks the ball out for the fumble also. I would go as far as to say they don't win this game without him. And this is really the first big Bosa game, I think, in a number of years, going back to maybe the Bills game in 2020, the Chiefs game in 2021, maybe, where Bosa was kind of flying around. This was one of those types of efforts from him. And, obviously a lot in the offseason and previous seasons has been made up of, hey, is Joey Bosa going to be healthy? And Bosa's even said himself, nobody cares about how great I feel in the offseason. I have to get there on the field and kind of show it for myself. And he came out there and made some really impressive run stops, like I mentioned before. Obviously, the sack and poking the ball out. He was just all over the place. And I think the way that Mack and Bosa played in particular really freed up the interior, the defensive line, to be as physical and as assertive as they were. And really, even going back to the Brandon Staley era for a minute, like that was the vision that Brandon Staley to some extent wanted as well, right? Kind of when they signed Sebastian Joseph Day, when they, tried to get, Bosa and Mack obviously to be healthy at the same time for years, it really felt like even that vision and into this Harbaugh vision, like when you have even average interior play combined with those two guys on the edge, plus, Tuli Tuipulotu and Bud Dupree as well, that's kind of what you get. And they forced Gardner Minshew, obviously, into some pretty bad decisions, and, forced the Raiders to kind of just, not have their passing game be much of a factor in terms of their, red zone drives later in this game. And I really think they kind of wore down the Raiders' offensive line as the game went on. So, you tip your hat to Khalil Mack, obviously having 2 sacks in this one as well. That last one he had where he was just taking, a bunch of guys to the weight room. It felt like, the one with Morgan Fox as well. He was insane. He always goes off against the Raiders. Obviously, he's probably not going to top his 6-sack game against the Raiders from last year. But I just thought from start to finish, him and Bosa in this game were so massive. Cannot be undersold just how good they were, how good this defensive line was up front. And that's the big takeaway for me in this Minter defense. And getting into that also, it just felt like everyone was a lot more comfortable in terms of what they should be doing, right? I mentioned sort of players talking about this as it was a read and react defense. And, you're just going to go, okay, but I want to see it, right? And the players looked fast, they looked aggressive, and they didn't look like they had to have a second thought on like, oh, I'm supposed to be there, right? Who am I supposed to be covering? At all times, it really felt like they were, well disciplined in that regard. Devontae Adams burns him a couple times, but overall, they kind of held him in check relative to, what we had seen prior. They didn't really let any other, receiver gain some momentum. It felt like every wide receiver, every tight end was kind of blanketed for really second quarter after that touchdown on. And so, we talked about the issues in coverage last year. I certainly don't expect upcoming games against the Chiefs or, any of the other difficult teams on the Chargers schedule to be as, simple to some extent as going up against Gardner Minshew, with, the Raiders offensive line performance, particularly later in the game. It's not going to come that easy. And there are going to be some times where this defense does struggle. But I think in terms of setting the tone week one, being really, really aggressive in the trenches, they did the best job that they could. And I really think that this secondary played well too, right? Even, Asante Samuel Jr. early in that game, right, gives up the touchdown to Alexander Madison. Both him and Dion Henley missed the tackle. It was right back to work, right? And ASJ was pretty locked down. I would say, played really unfallible kind of the rest of the game and unflappable. And that is a big difference from this team in previous years where you would just kind of see those mistakes snowball throughout the game. Whether it was like missed tackles, I remember the Dallas game in this regard last year, but plenty of games in recent years where you can remember missed tackles or a dropped interception or something like that, just kind of like snowballing for the team in a way where they would not be able to get off the field. And just overall as a whole today, they ended up being really, really well disciplined defensively. So, you got to obviously hand it to them in terms of how the defense cleaned up this game. I'm just going to read some of the team stats. Again, very efficient on third down as well. Raiders go 5 for 14 on third down, 0 for 1 on the fourth down. So yeah, all around, this was a really, really transcendent effort from a defense that I think after last year, after the last number of years, really needed this kind of game to go out there and assert themselves. Now, you see how Carolina looked today, right? That's, hopefully a good game for the defense as well, where they can just kind of keep stacking these weeks. Obviously, it's the NFL. It's not going to look perfect every week, and I certainly don't expect it to going forward when they play some more difficult teams and some worse quarterback matchups for them. But for the time being, this was, a really, really good effort from this defense. And I'm honestly not shocked, because I think we all felt that the Jesse Minter defense itself would be good. But I'm shocked at how quickly it sort of came together in this game. I thought there would be some moments where it's like, okay, here's a 100-yard Devontae Adams game. Okay, here's, a big rushing performance. Like, I did think the Minter defense would look good later on in the season, but the fact that they already hit the ground running in this game is huge. A bunch of guys, just to kind of read the stats out, over 7 tackles. Joey Bosa, Derwin James, Dion, pretty physical throughout the game. Perryman with a couple run stops as well. Mentioned the play of Poona Ford, Khalil Mack in this game as well. With 2 sacks, 2 quarterback hits. And not a whole lot more I think you could say about the defense other than they set the tone, took care of business, when some lucky turnovers might have been given to them. And, all of a sudden it just feels like this was the best game I have seen this defense play in a way that matters in a while, right? Going back probably to 2021 or 2022, maybe that Dolphins game from 2022, in terms of a first quarter to fourth quarter type of effort. Some stats here from PFF: Joey Bosa, 3 pressures, Mack, Dion Henley, and Poona Ford with 2 pressures each. And then you have Morgan Fox, Scott Matlock, John Taylor, and Junior Colson, all with 1 pressure as well. So overall, really great day from the defense. Don't necessarily want to overstate it, but that is certainly the thing I was most impressed with this game. Let's talk about the offense. I think for what it's worth, it looked better in the second half. Just in terms of particularly the story of this game, I think was the offensive line blocking in the first half, where it was a nightmare, right? You had Zion, Bozeman, and Trey Pipkins kind of converging into getting beaten on some of these, stunts that the Raiders were doing. A play early in that game where Max Crosby goes to the top, runs through the interior, and it's an immediate pressure on Herbert. Wilkins was giving them fits in the first half. And it just kind of felt like one of those games where the offensive line doesn't get their ish together, for lack of a better term. It could be a long night for the Chargers. And luckily, in the second half, things pick up. I thought Trey Pipkins had a really great performance, particularly in the second half. That block on Wilkins was great, and obviously opens up scoring opportunity for the team there. So we can talk about that, obviously. I think Zion, for what it's worth, played a better second half compared to the first. Bozeman as well. And then, got to talk about Joe Alt, who went up against Max Crosby, I think on 8 plays, 1-on-1, didn't allow a single pressure, right? And that is a litmus test that he passed. Now, it wasn't a perfect game from Joe Walters. Another play where I think in the first half he, gets absolutely thrown down by Wilkins, but those are rookie growing pains, right? Those are going to happen in the league in sort of a welcome to the league type of fashion for Alt. But holding your own against Max Crosby in this sort of atmosphere, in this sort of game, even when the offensive line wasn't, and particularly the interior, wasn't playing well in the first half, for Joe Alt to play through all that and play as well as he did, commitment to him. Slater, again, we could talk about him every week, but it feels like it's quiet every week just because, he takes care of his business. But obviously he's a huge part to what they were able to do today. So overall, I think the story of this game and where it turned for the Chargers was when the offensive line started responding to a lot of the stunts and the simulated pressures and the things that the Raiders were throwing at them in the first half. And that didn't come as sweet to them, certainly in the second half. So big commitment to them there. Big commends, big round of applause for them in terms of picking it up. And J.K. Dobbins. I do think we had to talk about the J.K. Dobbins game. Both him and Edwards to some extent struggle in the first half, primarily due to the offensive line more so than anything. But then there was that turn, and Dobbins cracks off those, 2 long runs. He finishes the game with 10 for 135 and the touchdown. And I didn't think that he had, that type of, the long speed for him, after the injuries and stuff like that will never go back. But what Dobbins, I questioned, I guess, coming into this season after the injuries and everything his body's been through the last couple of years, is that burst at the line of scrimmage. And if you watch this game, particularly in the second half, that burst to run through those holes, and get, cut and do everything successfully, it was there. And that is the kind of talent that obviously he was drafted from, in college and showed in his rookie season in Baltimore prior to all of the injuries, the last couple of years. And it really felt like he was back, not 100% back athletically, but, you talk about potentially taking running back 1 by the horns. And Greg Roman, as he said, I'm going to go with the hot hand. He kept feeding J.K. Dobbins in that second half, sort of turned down the Gus Edwards snaps a little bit. But incredible performance from him and Gus from the standpoint of pass protection as well. I think you noticed them pick up a few key blocks here and there that just it feels like particularly last year, Eckler for the most part was a good pass protector. But last year, I think that was something that was severely lacking from the running back room, was that aspect of pass protection. And Herbert even mentioned that in his press conference in regards to, what those 2 backs in Edwards and Dobbins were doing. So nice to see the gain that Dobbins had. And, I don't think he's going to have 135 yards every week. I don't think he's necessarily going to break off those 2 long runs every week. But if you can just kind of keep stringing those performances together and get that confidence and make teams respect the Chargers' ability to run the ball, which is, the goal of this new coaching staff to a degree, that's a massive win for the Chargers. And so great performance from Dobbins today. Let's talk a little bit about the pre-snap penalties, particularly in the first half. And Harbaugh's already said they have to clean it up. You had Will Dissly, I think, with 3 called on them. You had McConkey with another pre-snap penalty in the first half. And some of this was jitters, I think, to some degree, but just cannot have that happen. All of those, I think 5 pre-snap penalties or something like that in the first half. In the second half, they end up kind of settling in. But, not something that you want to see happen, particularly in one of these big rivalry games. And it's just they knew what the noise levels in SoFi were going to be throughout the whole week. So I was surprised to see them come out maybe as nervous a little bit as they were and as skittish as they were, just in terms of getting set to play offense in that first half. But, they settled in the second half and credit to them in that regard. And you obviously hope, that kind of continues throughout the season. And now that game one is out of the way, that they're not a heavily penalized team, particularly in pre-snap stuff that like really sets the drive back. So, you want to see the offense certainly in that regard be a little bit more disciplined. I want to talk about the wide receiver room. This is something I said on Twitter that I got a little pushback for. But I really felt like until kind of the final drives of that game, it just became a little bit apparent that, on a number of fronts, the Chargers do not have necessarily the optimal wide receiver one, right? They're obviously playing without Keenan, no Mike, as we've talked about, with their offseason decisions. And it was kind of a question mark of like, okay, this is Josh Palmer, Quentin Johnston, Ladd McConkey in this game, Brendan Rice, inactive, a DJ Chark is out. Like, who are going to be the guys that step up? And they went with Palmer and Johnston, primarily in that, like, on those 12 personnel looks. 11 personnel, you saw Ladd McConkey start in the slot on the field. And for about 3/4, it wasn't great. I think certainly part of this is, is Herbert getting chemistry with those guys, right? Misses the 2 weeks of training camp, and Greg Roman even said at the time, really valuable time to miss, right? You can't necessarily recreate those reps that were lost. And so that is a big part of this, I think. But still, I just thought for large parts of the game, it did look a little rough. I think later in the game, Quentin Johnston starts to put it together. McConkey starts to put it together. But I really do wonder just like how sustainable this is, I guess. And I don't necessarily like want to poop on the receiver room in week one, particularly after they win this game and McConkey gets the touchdown. But I really did think that they felt the loss of Keenan and Mike in this one in a significant way, where they don't necessarily have that guy in crunch time on money downs that is that well defined. And they played through it today, and J.K. Dobbins had 135 yards today, so it didn't matter. But it's something I think to watch going forward in terms of Herbert building the chemistry with these guys that are going to be in his wide receiver room. So that's something that I'm interested to see going forward here, is just how quickly the Chargers are able to get those connections going in between guys. And for the record, like, yes, I think by the end of the season, it'll look better today. I don't want to necessarily like bellyache about the wide receiver room too much, but there were some moments, some drops, obviously, that I think they wish they could have back, which I think is very fair. The challenge of this wide receiver room is like not having a set target number one guy, but hoping that this is a bit of a strength in numbers thing for them, and that guys like McConkey and QJ and Palmer gain confidence throughout the season. So something to watch, but just something that I kind of noticed in this game was could have been a little bit better. Let's talk about Herbert. So I think, let me just look at the final numbers that Herbert ended this game with. Overall, I think, not the best game from him. I think that's fair to say. Obviously, the Chargers running game in the second half was working well enough to the point where they didn't need Herbert to necessarily like go out and, steal this game for them. Finishes with a QBR of 31.8, passer rating of 92.5. For the record, I do not think, given the second half and Herbert kind of finding his zone there, that this was a bad game from Justin Herbert. And from a stat line perspective, given what Jim Harbaugh and company and Greg Roman want this offense to be, yeah, you probably gonna have to get used to a couple, 150, 200-yard games for Herbert in general going forward. And Harbaugh even kind of remarked at that in his post-game press conference, where he talked about, Herbert having 100 or whatever yards, but not carrying because, it was best for the team and stuff like that. I just thought the timing, was a little bit off today, particularly early in the game. Now a lot of pressure, in fairness to Herbert, was getting thrown in his face, right? Particularly from the get go. But I thought there were a couple wide open shots that he just kind of missed, right? The one in the back of the end zone where, he threw it out, could potentially had Hayden Hurst on that play. Um, Even the Josh Palmer drops, I kind of thought were a little bit more on Herbert, putting those balls quite a bit behind him. So weren't the best throws in that regard. Some questionable just processing things. But then, like I said, as the third quarter went on, you did feel that Herbert started to find his groove a little bit. Obviously, the run game, and sort of marrying the pass and the run helped the Chargers in this a lot. And Herbert talked about the performance of Dobbins post game. They needed that one, right? And there are got to be some games where Herbert throws for 25 passes. There are going to be some games where he throws for 40 passes, right? It's just a matter of what the offense needs and how it's clicking at any given time. But this was a game where you hope certainly for better protection in the first half. But even considering the better protection, this was probably a subpar game by Herbert standards. I think that's fair enough to say. Missing enough open looks, even after settling into it later, against a better offense, I don't know if that ever gets the job done. But, and this is part of the culture that Harbaugh and Minter and all of these guys to some degree want to build is, hey, even if Herbert doesn't necessarily play at his best level, we can still win it as a team, right? And if you look at Herbert's record in games where the Chargers, allowed under 20 points versus when they allowed over 20 points, you could say that for any quarterback in his defense, but that was particularly true for Herbert. So to be able to win a game and buy a game, particularly when he wasn't necessarily at his best, I think is to some extent a huge testament to what he was building here. And still, he had his fair share of good throws and good decisions in the second half as well. So, hope to see it more from him as the season goes on. Obviously, I think there were chemistry issues, from his time that he missed, like we mentioned. And just, this is his first game, not just since the end of last season, but also his first game since December 10th, right? Basically didn't play the whole last month of last season, didn't have any, preseason reps or anything like that. So I think to some extent, a lot of it is rust related issues that we are going to talk about with Herbert as he sort of, gets back to playing full football games again, right? And a lot of quarterbacks have those adjustments the first, 1 to 4 weeks or so. So not hitting the panic button by any means, but wasn't his best performance today. That being said, they got through it. And big credit to everybody involved on offense, particularly as the second half shifted, including Herbert making some better decisions. So let's wrap it up. I think that, let's do offensive and defensive stars of the game to a degree. My first star of the game is going to go to Joey Bosa on the defensive side of the ball. Thought he played an absolutely outstanding game. That is his best game in 3 or 4 years. And, we want to see a whole season of Bosa and Mac healthy, for starters. And this is the first step into that. So hopefully they get a whole season of those guys together. And as we saw today, and as we've seen in previous games, when both of those guys are clicking, it is just a different defense. On the offensive side of the ball, I would go with Joe Alt in this game. I thought, holding Crosby like he did and just not making any, particular mistakes that held the Chargers back. Big game in what was probably the worst possible matchup he could have week one from both an individual and offensive line standpoint, with what the Raiders were able to throw at them in the first half of that game. So for Joe Alt to essentially come out of this one unscathed, I think is a big testament to the work that he's put in. So, great stuff from them. I didn't really talk about special teams much today. A couple confusing moments, but obviously special teams star of the game is Dicker. Darius Davis, a little weird today. J.K. Scott, kind of a bad game from him relative to what we expect. But Dicker was on the money, nails another 50-yard field goal, and, proves worthy of the contract that the Chargers gave him. But that'll do it for today. Let me know your guys' thoughts in the comments below. As always, drop a like. Helps the show out quite a bit as well. And yeah, on to Carolina. Chargers will take on the Panthers next week. And after that game is when you will hear from me next week. So until next week, who's got it better than us? Nobody. And also bolt up and have a great Victory Monday.